Hi folks, thanks for being here to follow the second annual general meeting of the United Conservative Party. I think it was a hugely successful conference, not quite over yet, but we had over 1,700 dues-paying delegates from across the province who gave up their weekend to debate important issues about the future. I think it was a good, respectful, wide-open debate on policy issues as well as some internal party governance questions. And we had a great accountability session with our cabinet just now. I think what we've heard from our members is that they want us to focus on getting Alberta back to work and getting a fair deal for Alberta in Canada. Those are the priorities of the government. And those are also messages that I will be taking to the Council of the Federation with my Premier colleagues from across Canada later this afternoon as I fly to Toronto, meet with them over dinner tonight and then tomorrow. In 10 days, I will be traveling to Ottawa with several members of the Alberta Cabinet and several senior members of our public service to bring Team Alberta to Ottawa to reciprocate the offer made by Deputy Prime Minister Freeland to get into a serious conversation about the frustration in Alberta and how we can try to find common ground to get a fair deal for Alberta and get this economy back to work. I'll be spending about 3 days in Ottawa next week with a number of senior members of our team in a full court press to ensure that our Alberta voice is heard loud and clear by the new Trudeau cabinet and the federal public service. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Premier.
Oh, can I just ask, is there a French? Yeah, oui. Okay, okay, go ahead.
Mr. Premier, in terms of the problems with unions that are looming, big demonstration yesterday ended up with some pushing and shoving. How concerned are you that civility may get thrown out the window in this?
Well, that does really concern me, and I would ask Ms. Notley and the government union leaders to be careful about their language. Inciting people to violence, I think, undermines their own cause, and it doesn't respect the kind of civility that Albertans respect. Look, we obviously, in a period of fiscal restraint, any government is going to face protests and opposition from government unions. And that is absolutely their democratic right and to exercise their freedom of association and their freedom of speech. But it should never cross the line into abuse, aggression, particularly towards women, which I understand happened yesterday, that some union or NDP activist physically assaulted a woman who was from a media outlet out front. That is totally unacceptable. And I hope that we'll hear from the organizers of that protest. I hope they will completely disavow that. And I hope we'll hear an effort to moderate their rhetoric, not to whip people up into a frenzy. But as I said last night, let's try to seek the path of cooperation and collaboration, not confrontation.
Hey, Premier.
Hi.
Looking ahead at the Premier's meeting this week, Premier Ford's pitch for healthcare transfers for the increase to go from 3% to 5.2%. What do you think of that? And do you have your own idea on that?
Well, our focus, frankly, is on issues of immediate concern to Albertans. First of all, getting guarantees for the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Secondly, getting a full equalization rebate by lifting the cap on the fiscal stabilization program and in the future reforming that program to recognize when provinces such as ours have a sudden precipitous decline in their revenues. And thirdly, by repealing or substantially changing Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law, which we think will put a pall on major job-creating investment in the future, particularly with respect to the energy sector and pipelines. I've had conversations with a number of my colleagues across the country who seem to be in pretty broad agreement on those points. I think we're going to see, hopefully, a strong consensus on reform of the fiscalization program, stabilization program. Excuse me, did I say fiscalization? That's what happens when you're sleep deprived. On the fiscal stabilization program, the equalization rebate, and on Bill C-69, I will listen to what my colleagues have to say about increasing health transfers. But our focus, again, is on those other issues.
And on the stabilization or fiscalization program, what specific reforms are you looking for? Obviously, Alberta wants essentially a back payment, but going forward, what actual changes would you like to see to that?
Well, I think Premier Moe will be, first I'd point to a couple, we're going to be, in fact, I spoke to Premier Legault about having our officials work together to develop ideas which Quebec could support for significant enhancement to fiscal stabilization. Premier Moe, I understand, will be maybe tabling an idea to reduce or to show a greater impact when there is a non-renewable resource revenue decline felt by a particular province. That could make a material positive impact for Saskatchewan and Alberta. But our starting point is to retroactively lift the cap. This program, the first time it was used, I understand, was in 1986 when Alberta saw a big revenue hit. And I think Alberta got $700 million out of it that year. And the feds immediately imposed a $60 per capita cap on it, which means that we are effectively capped at $250 million a year. So at the very least, we must see the cap lifted. We want to see that lifted retroactively to recognize the pain we've been going through for 5 years. But we think there are other reforms that would, again, show a greater reflection of a sudden decline in non-renewable resource revenues.
Yeah, two questions. First, the Citizens Initiative Act that you announced, I guess, for the second time yesterday.
Yeah.
How does that differ from the Recall Act, and when can we expect it to be brought down?
Sure. So the Recall Act, first of all, is something we committed to in the platform, but MLA Smith has brought it forward as a private member's bill. Our platform committed to using thresholds similar to those that have been in place in British Columbia since, I believe, 1991. And that, of course, gives citizens the ability, if an adequate number, sign a formal legal petition in a certain period of time. I think in British Columbia it's 40% of electors in 60 days. Then they can force a by-election. And that you want the threshold high enough to avoid frivolous abuse, but low enough that it in an extreme case, actually can trigger a by-election. It did happen, almost, in BC. The citizens in Parksville, Qualicum, qualified for a recall, but the guy resigned before it went to by-election. So that's the recall side. Citizens Initiative is about the same ability of citizens to, through a legal petition, ask for a referendum on a particular subject matter. Again, I would look to the BC model for the thresholds to ensure that questions that get on the ballot are within provincial jurisdiction, that they comply with the Constitution, for example. And again, this has been in the 28 years that the British Columbia citizen-initiated referendum law has been in place. It has been used only once, and that was to force a referendum on the harmonization of the PSD with the GST. So we think this would be a kind of, in case of emergency, break glass opportunity for the public if political leadership is not listening.
And the bill is going to be coming in this session?
Next session. We will have a series of democratic reform bills in the next session.
All right. The other question concerns the 3% reduction in spending. And you're always bringing up Ralph Klein is 20%, and this is much milder than that. But why not go to the 20%? Or is, I mean,
you know what? That's a totally fair question. I don't know why I don't get asked that more often, but I think it's a totally legitimate question. Why are we? Frankly, our government is going to oversee an significant increase in the debt over the next 4 years. I don't like it. The reason is this. We are in an economic trough that Alberta was not in 93, 94. And so the economy is much more fragile, for starters. Secondly, we want to take a very deliberate and careful approach to this. I think one of the lessons learned from the Klein experience was they had to go back and undo some of those cuts because they were fairly arbitrary across the board, and we don't want to make that mistake. Finally, we're listening to the McKinnon panel, which said, focus on big structural reform that will yield long-term savings as opposed to the easy arbitrary percentage cuts. And so getting deep savings in some of these areas is going to take time. And we wanted to do this carefully and prudently. And finally, that was our commitment to Albertans.
And this is just for the current budget, right?
Yeah, well, this is the current 4-year period. It's a 2.8% reduction in operating spending between now and fiscal year 2022-23, which is, I believe, $1.3 billion on a $55 billion budget. So, listen, I understand that the NDP, I mean, their job, their reason for existing is to tax more and spend more. So I get why they would oppose even a modest program of fiscal restraint. But they're making this out to be like the arrival of the apocalypse. This is ridiculous. This is, by modern Canadian fiscal standards, one of the most modest periods of fiscal restraint. And so I just wish everybody would be a little more objective in their language around this. All right, next question, I guess.
My question is actually coming from some readers over the last 2 days, and it's about Calgary City Council. On Friday night, City Council delivered their Black Friday special, which is a 7.51% property tax hike to homeowners and double-digit tax hikes to small business. Your minister, Mr. Madhu, has already spoken, saying he was infuriated and said the Calgary City Council spending was out of control and they were quote-unquote spending freaks. I think a lot of our readers would like to know what you think, because in the past you have spoken about your desire to have city councils and municipalities rein in, not do what was done on Friday.
Well, my message to municipalities, large and small, is let's be Team Alberta, focused on the same goal, which is getting this province back to work. And that's not going to happen if we're all raising taxes. Now, my concern is this, that many of our municipalities, including the city of Calgary, have seen tax and revenue increases over the past decade. This is not just 1 year. This is not just this year. This is over a decade. Tax and revenue increases that have far outstripped population growth, economic growth, and inflation. That is not a sign of efficiency. And that is why our platform committed us to developing and publishing an easy-to-read fiscal scorecard on all of our municipalities, so citizens will be able to go online and very simply see what has been the real and absolute increase in spending and in taxes, and compare it to other jurisdictions. And maybe we should do that for other jurisdictions across Canada and North America. So we would just ask, whether it's Calgary or other municipalities, we know these are challenging times. But as I said in my speech last night, taxpayers can't pay more right now.
So what was your reaction? I mean, Mr. Madhu's reaction was he was infuriated. You're also a Calgary taxpayer, as well as being the Premier. What was your reaction when you first heard that unexpectedly they were levying, as I say, a 7.5% increase on homeowners and double digits on somebody who is running a shop in a strip mall?
Well, I guess it just seemed like a replay of the past 10 years. It didn't seem like this has just been going on and on. And I would just say that ultimately Calgary voters are in charge. They have municipal election every 3 years, and if they think that there needs to be a greater focus on fiscal restraint, then they have the right to elect councillors and who share that view.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Kenney. Premier Kenney.
But whatever you want. Hey, you.
Yeah. Hey, you. Sir. I noticed your speech didn't mention anything about Andrew Scheer, who spoke the night before. Do you feel that the Alberta Conservatives are strongly behind the leadership of Andrew Scheer?
Well, I invited Andrew to speak at our convention for a reason, and I wanted him to have an opportunity to thank Alberta Conservatives, who gave him the largest Democratic mandate for a federal party in the history of this province, 70% of Albertans voting for Mr. Scheer's Conservatives, winning all but one of the seats in the province. So I'm glad he was able to come and convey that message. And I think he received a very positive response from the crowd here. I know some of you guys were predicting there was going to be protests and walkouts. I didn't see any of that. I'm sure he doesn't have the support of 100% of the people who were in that room. But my sense, being around this convention, is that most Alberta Conservatives, while obviously disappointed with the re-election of the Trudeau government, understand that Mr. Scheer won the largest number of votes of any federal Conservative leader since 1867, won the popular vote, won the highest vote share ever in Alberta, increased by, I think, 23 seats, the number across Canada, picked up in pretty much every region. And that reduced Mr. Trudeau to a minority, which most of us thought was impossible 3 or 4 years ago. So I think most Alberta Conservatives feel that it was a strong outcome. I'll tell you, my own view is you don't. There's no point in getting into a partisan civil war. That's just a huge distraction from the task at hand, which for him is to hold the federal government to account, and for us it's to get things done for Alberta.
Do you think his leadership's on shaky ground, though?
Look, there's no secret. There's a leadership review vote in the spring, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of noise between now and then. Ultimately, it will be up to the delegates there to decide. I would just say that Stephen Harper lost the 2014 election, and carried on as leader, became one of the great Conservative prime ministers. So I think that stability makes a lot more sense than internal conflict. That's all I can say.
Premier, there's talk of a general strike. There's never been one in Alberta, to my knowledge. I've never heard union leaders talk about that before. But they're talking about it now, and they sound like they're serious. What do you make of it, and what would you do if there was actually a cross-sector, cross-department, healthcare, education, whatever kind of strike organized? Well,
I'm not going to speculate on complete hypotheticals. I will say that we encourage government union leaders to choose the path of collaboration and not confrontation. The truth is this: a number of those same leaders have, in the wage reopener arbitration, asked for salary increases in 1 year of as much as 8%. When the average private sector family's income is down by 8% over the past 4 years. This seems to me like a union leadership that is really out of touch with what's going on in this province. I acknowledge and thank folks in the public service for the good work they do. I acknowledge that many have gone through a wage freeze, although it must be noted that in many of those professions they do get increases in their salary level with tenure, with seniority. But they need to realize that in many cases they receive better benefits and better relative compensation than the private sector, and that taxpayers cannot pay more. So I would say to those folks, let's sit down and work this out. We want to minimize any effect on our public services, including those in our teachers and nurses. We value what they do. I would just plead with them to look at the general economic and fiscal situation of this province. I do not think something like a general strike, demanding an 8% increase in wages when we're in the 5th year of economic decline, will be well received by Albertans who pay the bills.
Good afternoon. On the idea of an independent Alberta pension plan, there has been some talk of it perhaps being used to invest in oil and gas companies that otherwise wouldn't make it, being used to prop up. Is there anything to that, and what would you tell someone concerned about that happening?
No, there is nothing to that. So obviously this is all speculative at this point. Stage 1 is the Fair Deal panel consulting with Albertans, including on the concept of creating an Alberta pension plan. Stage 2, if there's a green light there, the stage 2 would be to do a serious, deep policy analysis on the feasibility of an Alberta pension plan, the costs, what prospective liabilities we would bring from the CPP, the cost of administering the benefit side, as well as the asset management aspect of a provincial pension plan. On the latter point, and on your question, I think we have a very good structure in place with AIMCO, the Alberta Investment Management Corporation, that's been getting very strong returns, average on the rate of 8 to 9%. And it's now managing about $145 billion of assets. If it were to become the asset manager for the Alberta Pension Plan, it would be managing upwards of $200 billion, almost the size of the Caisse de dépôt in Quebec. I think we can look to the Caisse de dépôt as a instructive example of the effective management of pension assets, including the Quebec pension plan for citizens of that province. But the mandate, let's be clear, the mandate would be to maximize returns for pension beneficiaries, not to engage in some kind of industrial policy. So AIMCO is entirely arm's length from government. It is an independent expert. It's run by a series of executives who have expertise in financial management under an independent board. It should never be given a political direction on how to invest the money that belongs to pensioners. And so, no, that would not be the point of this. I think one of the benefits would be expanding the financial services industry. If we end up with a fund that has upwards of $200 billion in it, you would see a real critical mass of expertise in major asset management. I think that would be good for our economy. But again, all of this ultimately will be up to Albertans.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the current structure that AIMCO manages under today, you don't see any additional safeguards being needed or additional structuring being needed?
Well, look, if Albertans were to approve that, and I've been clear that we would only proceed with this if Albertans approve of it in a referendum, because it's a very big issue, and the money belongs to them, not the government, and it's not something we ran on. We want to let Albertans have a debate about this, and ultimately to make a decision about it if we think it's viable. And at that point, yeah, perhaps we would need to strengthen legislation. I think the AIMCO legislation is pretty strong already. In one instance, the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, they manage money that belongs to the government of Alberta, so we can indicate to them what the kind of investment priorities are. But that would not be the case with an APP, and I'd be happy to consider making that absolutely clear in legislation. Okay. Dernière question en français parce qu'il faut que j'aille.
Sur la péréquation, je comprends que vous êtes optimiste sur la stabilisation, mais sur la péréquation, comment est-ce que vous pouvez convaincre les autres provinces d'arriver à une entente sur un changement de péréquation?
Je crois que le Saskatchewan le Premier ministre Moe est en accord avec moi à cet égard. Évidemment, le Québec ne pas. Mais je vais continuer à soulever la réforme de péréquation parce que nous croyons que c'est injuste envers l'Alberta en particulier. Et ça serait un enjeu possible pour un référendum en Alberta en 2021. Cela étant dit, cette semaine, nous allons mettre l'accent parmi les premiers ministres sur la question du programme de stabilisation fiscale. Parce que c'est une façon de donner l'Alberta un peu plus d'équité dans la fédération sans un coût pour les autres provinces. OK, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.